I have yortzeit tonight from my mother. It was Chayasara Bat Miriam. And as a good Jewish mother, she always would, good Jewish mothers in those days said to my son, the doctor, because to go, like we were just talking, going to med school was a big thing, And now today it's so full of Jews, it's not a problem. But instead of calling, I didn't go to med school, but she had something for me. Book knowledge, not worth a nickel. She was a very practical woman, worked for the government, and she's a very practical woman. And she said many, many times, book knowledge, not worth a nickel. And indeed, it took me 40 years to appreciate the wisdom in that little thing of book knowledge, not worth a nickel. Because I was so dominated by the mind and by the intellection, philosophical and theological and religious, that what happened to the practical world? Well, it disappeared. And it took 40 years to recover that practical world and realize that there's people. And no person in any way is lower than an idea. Ideas are ideas, and people are people. When Chana was born, my firstborn daughter, I had a late class, and I used to finish 10 o'clock. I went to Mount Sinai Hospital. I said, I'm Dr. Levinson. Oh, yes, doctor, yes, doctor. Your wife is this and that. And so I said, my wife just gave birth. When I came to the class the next day, I started by saying, philosophy, not worth a nickel. And the students looked at me and I said, well, my wife just gave birth to a daughter. How can you compare life to ideas? It's just flat. Anyway, Rosh Hashanah. So as you know, the tefillah it begins with ha-melech, and mishtabach before the ha-melech. And then in the Shmon Esrei we have Zochreinu l'chaim, melech chofetz b'chaim, v'kozveinu b'sefer hachaim, lamancha Elohim chaim. Four times the word chaim, and linked up to melech. And what I want to talk about tonight is what is this connection between melech, Rosh Hashanah, the new year, and what's the connection between melech and chaim. Okay, now the word melech in Hebrew literally means king. But in different contexts it takes on a different meaning. It doesn't refer to a person ruled by one, a monarchy, ruled by a king, or a kingship we call it, as a form of government. It refers to sovereign. The sovereign in the state is melech, the highest. It has the most perfect, unique. It has different meanings in different contexts. And one of the meanings that it has is, in addition to this idea of completeness, perfect, unique, the highest, sovereign, it has the meaning of malacha, work. In the Chumash, there's two meanings for work. One is avodah, and one is malacha. And malacha comes from melech. And malacha, when they deal with the Mishkan, for example, they deal with malacha. When we deal with the Kohanim, for example, theirs was a work, was avodah. I thought of the idea that it could be one of the differences is between avodah and malacha is that avodah has a kind of a fixed set of procedures. So a Kohen, and so it had different procedures, and it's relatively speaking a fixed set that's done by habit, and you know what you're supposed to do, first step, second step, third step, like following instructions. As contrasted with malacha, which would be creative dimension. When Bezalel, we talk about the Mishkan, we talk about craftsmanship, the artist, and so on. We're talking about malacha because it's not following a set of rules, it's immersion in the creative process and yields sometimes surprises. Just b'derech hagav, I spent a lot of time in the past on understanding the artistic world, how it operates. And I thought, well, an artist, he has if he's a musician, he sort of has the whole score in the head, and then he articulates this and puts it down in symbolic notation and then play and so on and so on. And then makes changes. But basically, from the beginning, there's the plan. I found out that that's not true. That's not true. For some creative people, it is true. The person really sees the whole thing, the whole novel and so on in the head, and then executes it. And there's a relative separability between the execution, the process, and the result. The other view was much more prevalent, and more people hold that idea, namely, the person starts with a vague, indeterminate idea, which starts to take determinateness as he works with the material. So if he's an artist and he works with the material, then the colors and the space, and at a certain point, bingo, it clicks and he now sees the whole picture. Now he sees how he's going to end it. But in the beginning, if you ask him, how are you going to end this novel? Love story, whatever it is, how are you going to end this? He said, well, I don't know. I'm playing with this and playing with that, but I really don't see it clear. And so in the creative process, you have this dimension of surprise, of even I'll talk a little later about taking risk. Because if you're not clear from the beginning, then I'm going to play. I'm going to take a risk. I didn't try this. If I mix these two colors, I'll get this kind of a shade. And it may not be what I want. Okay, so then, on painting you can erase it and I'll come back to it. That's what happened. So the artistic process, just b'derech hagav, was for me a very important thing in the early years to understand means-end relationships, especially in intelligence and in the art world. And later we could add game theory because that's part of this whole picture. Okay. Now, when we talk about kingship in the Torah system, the goal of kingship is to have citizens obey from love, not from fear of punishment. The whole work, or important concerns or aims of the Memshalah, of the political organization of society, is on the one hand to maintain peace, and on the other hand to maintain stability that comes from following rules. But in the Torah system, there's an emphasis to try to educate the people, the public, to love the laws, to love the king because of the laws. In the classical term, this is a benevolent monarch. The king we're talking about a king that's not getting power and all kinds of concern to conquer. It's concerned with the benevolence transferred to the people. So kingship is a rule of one, a monarchy, but the high form is that it's a benevolent monarchy, and everything the king does is for the good of the people. And in Judaism, the king is not above the law. The king is on the one hand, the sovereign, has a function, but the king is not absolute sovereign. So call it relative sovereignty. And in certain contexts, the king, like we say, without a people, there's no king. So this was part of the story. So, just to note that the Torah system, when it dealt with the political, the goal was how to get the people to obey, to have it's an obligation, but not by fear of punishment. You have to have punishments to keep the order and the structure, but on the other hand, you don't want the whole sensitivity and ethos of the people to be built on punishment. Okay, what's the connection between melech, kingship, monarchy, sovereignty, and chaim? Okay, so on Rosh Hashanah we see ourselves, or should see ourselves, as kingly, as unique. In other words, Rab Nachman talks about giving l'chav zchut to somebody. His basic point is, and a very beautiful piece, and this is key for his whole understanding of the Torah system, that you can't give somebody else the benefit of the doubt on something if you don't give yourself the benefit of the doubt. That's a fundamental, in the Hebrew called l'chav zchut, but it's a fundamental principle that goes through all of Rav Nachman's orientation. So, to generalize it, you can't recognize HaKadosh Baruch Hu as king unless you recognize yourself as kingly. Now, that's why I started before with the difference between the person. You're not a king, but you're kingly. You can look at yourself from the point of view of being kingly. In the l'chav zchut example, we come for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and to fulfill Rav Nachman's point is not easy. Because we center on averot, we center on wrongs, we center on the things that we didn't do, we didn't come up to par, and we're not centering on those aspects of ourselves that were great, somebody had a fantastic Shabbat Suda. Why isn't that come through right off the bat with a whole list? Instead of al chet, we have this simcha dimension that comes. Well, it's not there. There's an emphasis on the wrongdoing, on the averot. And so, to generalize the point, I made this analogy that one is responsible, of course, all the time, but especially on the beginning of the new year. There's an orientation here to begin to look at oneself anew. Look at oneself anew, look at oneself as special, as kingly, as majestic. And this is a very, very big point, as you realize, because somehow it's gotten lost and eclipsed by an overemphasis on wrongdoings. And Rav Nachman cut through that, and I just developed the analogy based on that. Okay. Like we relate to others as we relate to ourselves. And who? Life, first of all, to oneself. Can't see HaKadosh Baruch Hu as king, as sovereign, unless sees oneself as kingly. Okay? So, how do we do that? What do we do? So we first look at what we work at. Our work world. Malacha, our work world. First, is it avodah? Is it malacha? We are now saying, okay, it's this or that, or a mixture of both. And what should we be doing in methodology? We should be thinking about ourselves, each person thinking and catching the stream of consciousness in each person that comes with saying, oh, I'm a shoe salesman. I'm a yeshiva bucha. In other words, I put it before in chalos language. Who am I? Who am I? You know, I'm putting this self-referential chalos. You see, and I am a worker. This is my. Remember, work. Most of life is work. So, the methodology here is to focus on attention on oneself, and to catch the stream of consciousness that accompanies looking at oneself. Because in that stream of consciousness you will discover the life dynamics that's operating in you. When you're too studied and you're too much in control, then what comes out is not really the full you. It takes the form of a kind of a rationalization. And the mind has a great power to do that and to really falsify the reality. Because the reality has, in addition to the thought that you're enunciating, it has a realm of feelings and a realm of action. And so there's 2/3 of the person. Those components will be caught by you, by the person, in this catching the stream of consciousness. If you can't catch them all at once, fine, you catch 1, 2, 3. The next day you continue, you have 10 days till Yom Kippur, when we're putting an emphasis on this introspection and so forth. And so, if you catch this, you will catch whether you're fooling yourself, not fooling yourself. Do you have enjoyment? Now we don't. If you don't enjoy your work, well, that's not the highest, to say the least. It'd be wonderful if you enjoyed the work. And in Devarim, the end of the curses, and Moshe Rabbeinu says he's worried that Klal Yisrael will not keep the mitzvot with simcha. They'll keep the mitzvot by obligation. But obligation is not the highest plane. To keep the mitzvot with enjoyment, with simcha, with fullness, is the thing he was worried about. Okay, so you see where I'm going. I'm not moving in the direction of tshuva in the traditional sense. I'm widening up the process of tshuva in a much larger frame, heavily psychological, because that stream of consciousness. Right now, you, me, and you, and so we are psychologically oriented people with different psychological properties. All the way up from behavior psychology, to personality psychology, to psychoanalysis. The full range of psychological entry into a person it starts with the biological and physiological, of course, the body, but then it moves into the psychological, and it has a full range of characteristics that make up you in the now, right now. And so the method is being presented here to link up and look at oneself as kingly and catch the stream of consciousness material to see and determine in what respects are you not, in what respects are you. In other words, to use the material to do self-reflection, introspection on the who am I? Who am I? And having come through with these psychological dimensions. Okay. I put about Betzalel, who was working on the Mishkan. One never gets tired of malacha. When you fall in love with Chazal, you never get tired. It never becomes a burden. It becomes an immersion, a joining together. And you never get tired. As a matter of fact, I heard once Rav Soloveitch talk about his father, that whenever he was down in the dumps, or Moshe, he would go learn. And it didn't mean take your mind off. It meant perk up that whole feeling of simcha. And as you know, if you ever been to shiurim by great halacha people, you could see the room light up when they get a chiddush, and they articulate it for the boys and so forth. You see the whole, the air changes, everything changes. Because in that moment, in 4 or 5 minutes, right, there's a whole culmination of a shakal v'taya into a kind of a conclusion, and so forth. We're going to come back to that, but this is just an example of the idea that in avodah, because it's rule following, it has a different effect, a different orientation on the person. It gets its importance from the importance of the rules, of what you're doing. So when the Kohen Gadol and so on has to do this and this and this, this is not, because it's not malacha, it doesn't in any way belittle what he's doing, except that there's two different psychological packages that go with the two different orientations. Okay. Shofar is the awakening of the person to this realization of looking at oneself as kingly, as majestic, and to transfer it to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that you can relate now to Hashem from the point of view of yourself. So we're starting not with the king, but with the person. And that gives us the entry into the celebration or the orientation to being celebrating, being with HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the new year. The new self that you come to, or the old self, but it's redone each year, it's redone. And you were a tzaddik before, you're a tzaddik now. It doesn't mean that everything has to be new. Some of those stream of consciousness materials will be similar to what you were before, but some will be new. And this is the dimension of the linkage here between melech, malacha, and kingship. So I say, kingly work is never ending. Now we come to the big point of what, with more specifics, is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur about. And the question is, when one is engaged in malacha, is there completeness or not? When one is engaged in avodah, which is a set of rules, okay, when one finishes doing the things according to the rules, there's a finish to the situation, to the obligation. It's finished. It's complete. But in kingly work, there's never an end, and the question becomes, is it complete? Can completeness be achieved by the human being? In the classical theological understanding, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is complete, perfect, carried by the notion of melech. Sovereign means here not only just the king in terms of one person, of the ruler, but the sovereign, the what do I want to say? Yeah. Okay, so one could say, yes, perfection. We say HaKadosh Baruch Hu is perfect, man is imperfect. That's the standard picture. And then, of course, the organization of the Yom Tov, and so it reflects this whole difference between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the human being. That we are imperfect, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is perfect. We are in the middle of knowing, never have completeness in knowing. Hashem knows all. So it's omniscient, omnipotent, and we have that classical picture of the relation between the human being and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And I'm starting here from a different approach, legamre. It's not starting from Hashem, it's starting from each yachid, and then gets projected outward into Hashem. And the whole issue of whether or not there is such a thing as perfection or completeness becomes the fundamental focus, fundamental question that the holiday is coming to answer. And indeed, we have the answer in the Yom Kippur service, where in the Korban, there was two parts to the Korban. There was one, the animal that was chosen by a lottery, which goat was to go for a Korban, and which goat was to be sent to the Midbar. Okay, now what's that all about? Whatever kapara means, the kapara was not complete unless there was the korban of the animal, according to the proper rules, and the death of the animal, the goat that was sent to the Midbar. We're not going into any of that tonight to understand in more detail what was going on. But the basic point is that you needed both to have kapara, to have a clean slate, to have a wiping away of all the averot, of all the nidarim, and called nidre, and so on, to be able to say, I can start afresh. And the Kodesh Baruch Hu will recognize that new start and will be with me in that new orientation of the new start. That's the traditional view. And so the kapara, the completion, required that that animal, that goat, be killed, die, not killed. It's the midbar, it's the wilderness, and there's life forms, there's predators, animals, that could kill this goat. There's a steep, it was off the cliff, it was like thrown off a cliff. When you throw something off a cliff, even an animal, a goat, which is very has this ability to maneuver and so on and so on, nevertheless, the probability is it will die. It will be killed by another animal, or it will not be able to get enough food or water to survive. So that the probability is that it will be killed, and the kapara will be complete for the individual person and for Klal Yisrael as a whole. But there is no certainty that the animal, the goat, will die, will be killed. It's left open in the text, in the Chumash, especially when it describes this procedure. It's left open as to whether or not there is completeness of the kapara. Now, in the Gemara, when Chazal dealt with this ceremony, they added a dimension that was not in the original text, or, let's put it a different way, there are two ways of looking at the procedure. And so Chazal put a red ribbon on, tied it on the animal, and so the idea would be that this would help us at some future time. Somebody will find the ribbon, and this will help indicate that the animal died. Okay, whether it's true or not important, but the point is that there was a need for closure, for completeness, that at the time of Chazal was very, very important to the whole understanding of Yahadut, of Judaism. It had an idea of king, the idea of kingship, the idea of sovereignty, and the idea of perfection and completeness. We call it tikkun olam, right? The perfection of the world. That there is such a thing as completeness, as perfection. And it localized in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and then rubbed off as much as possible on the human being. And the question becomes, does the human being have completeness? And from the ceremony on Yom Kippur, we see that the message of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is that the human being can never get completeness at any level, and he has to learn how to live with insecurity, incompleteness. And that's what I generalize from the orientation. Now, the implications are tremendous, because, as you know, philosophy in the Greeks, for example, had nothing to do with religion, had a critique of religion. They put religion as concerned with piety, but not in terms of justice, temperance, courage, the virtues. So that there was a place for religion, but in the philosophy, the goal was hierarchy. For Plato, for example, closure. That there was a level in Plato, for example, language breaks down and myth takes the place. Every dialogue has a myth, and myth takes the place of ordinary language in the dialogues, Myth takes the place and says, look, there's something beyond language. There's something that is this completeness. But we can't articulate it in straight univocal language, where each term has a meaning and so forth. And we can't do it good enough with analogy. And so one of the virtues at the top was contemplation. That was a virtue. Namely, if you get a closedness, a closure, a completeness, then there's no new problem. So you enjoy, shall we say, you enjoy the completion. There is this completion. So I say, in the Torah system, as indicated in Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, it's starting with the idea, it's coming to the conclusion that there is no completeness of any kind in the human being. Certainly, we deal with work, we deal with intellect, and we have the notion of completeness. And in the human being, in life, hachaim, in life, one of the big drives of the human being is indeed completeness, perfection, striving for more than yourself. And this took the form of life after death. This took the form of some closure on life. The human being wants and strives and feels there's something missing if he doesn't have this closure. As anybody knows, when I just went through a mild stroke, well, the person wants a closure. The person wants to leave the world with a dignity that functions in him to stop and give an at-rest to completeness. Yes, life is complete. And so it's a striving built into the human being. But the teaching is that one has to realize that there is no such completeness. In the contemporary world, we have seen that in Gödel's incompleteness theorem, because Gödel was a logician and a mathematician and showed that in a tight system of logic, there's no conceptual completeness. Kal v'chomer, everything else in life, in intellect. So the history of philosophy until the 20th century was systematic. There were systems of philosophy. When you took a course in philosophy, it said Spinoza, Leibniz, whatever, that was it. But there was no such thing as philosophy of. There was a system, and that system was architectonic and covered with different principles and different methodologies. It covered as much comprehensiveness as it could get, and it had a certain closure. Each of the systems, different though they be, had a closure. Closure was built into the philosophical endeavor. In the 20th century, because of the emphasis on the nature of language, which we can talk about some other time, there was a shift away from closure and system to philosophy of religion, philosophy of language, philosophy of the courses in the book. If you look at the courses, you take an old syllabus book, where they give you the outline of the courses, you'll see the difference right off the bat. Hits you on the head. Because now it was philosophy of religion, philosophy of art, philosophy of science, and so on. And that's the way the whole field of philosophical inquiry and contribution and product shifted away from closure. Paradigmatic in this respect was the pragmatic tradition of William James, John Dewey, Charles Sanders Peirce, who were the leading pragmatists and the practical tradition. And they led the way in the 20th century to realize that there is no closure in intellect. Yours truly, in 1954, I wrote a master's thesis on John Dewey. And John Dewey had a parallel analysis of freedom and culture. One of his books was called Freedom and Culture. And in that book, he visualized two parallel lines, and there was a constant interface between the two concepts of freedom and culture. And he developed that in the book, okay? And of course, the young philosopher guy says, he's all wrong. What are you talking about? I'm coming in with, I'm a Torah person, I'm keeping the mitzvot. What kind of a thing is that? No closure? The two lines have to meet. It's not, the picture is not two parallel lines that go on forever. There's two parallel lines that go on, and then at a certain point, they meet. And they come to a point. They come to a point. I'm not talking now about non-Euclidean geometry, but which explodes the parallel postulate. That was the breakthrough in non-Euclidean geometry. But I'm just talking from the point of view of the model, that there was a continuum analysis, and there was relative closure. Sure, you could live without relative closure. After you learned how to open the door, then you move on automatically to other problems. How to open it when there's an obstacle and it was a block. When there's relative closure on everything in life. But there's no completeness. There's no absolute closure. And in intellect and in philosophy, we see that in the pragmatic tradition, that there is no absolute closure, absolute completeness. Of course, coming in as a Torah person, how could one hold a philosophy like that? And it took 40 years to figure out and realize that the Torah has a whole practical dimension of l'maaseh, of how you do things, how you live according to them. And in that livability, one of the things that's pointed out is that, again, if you think you really have got closure, you've got something else. Because there is no completeness. There's incompleteness at every plane. So there's incompleteness on the intellectual level, as indicated, and why a science becomes so fundamental as in the 20th century. It started in Newton in the 17th century, but there was still embedded, Newtonian philosophy, Newtonian science was embedded in system. System. There was Spinoza and there was Descartes. System was the name of the game, philosophical game. And so there was system. And there was indeed metaphysics. There was a level of analysis, and then there was something next level, higher level. And there was what we call a meta level. Even in knowing. You can know something, then you can know the knowing. Then you can know the knowing of the knowing. And in some philosophies in the medieval period, you had this unending levels of, here's the relation, so you knew the body, you knew the perception, you knew something. Then that thing becomes an object for knowledge, and that itself now becomes another level object, and you go on ad infinitum, higher and higher and higher. You should know that in the Kabbalah, as usually understood, in the Kabbalah system, you have the Sfirot, 10, divided into 1, 1, 1, 6, and 1, but it's really built on 5. And just for the information, the Kabbalah system is built on 5 aspects of the neshama, the psyche, whatever you want to call, but it was built on 5, but it was 1, 1, 1, 6, and 1. So, Keter, Chachma, Bina, or Bina, Chachma, Bina, Da'at, was 1 each. And in shiur terms, in measure terms, they use the decimal system, and Chachma is 1.0, Keter 1.0, Bina 1.0. Then the other 6 is 0.6, 0.1, 0.1, 1/10. And Malchut is 0.01. So Malchut had this hundreds, the 6 were in the middle of the 10, and it becomes 3.61. 3.61 is the number that represents the Sfirot system. But in the spiritual system in the Kabbalah, there's levels within levels. And so there's Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. And then there's Chesed, the Chesed. There's the next level dividing the Chesed into another plane, However, it stops at 4. Now the question becomes in Kabbalah study whether or not it stops, because the complexity after 4 levels becomes unworkable, or there is completeness, but we are not privy to the completeness. So what I found in the Kabbalah study, that it's left open to determine whether there's completeness or not. But the system certainly works on Chesed, Chesed the Chesed, Chesed the Chesed the Chesed, and so on, and then Gvura the Chesed, so that this gives the system, and indeed it is a system, this gives the system a hierarchical structure and more comprehensiveness. Because as you start, when you say Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, or Chochmah, Bina, Das, well, a lot has to go in there. If you now say Chesed the Chochmah, you now are putting together something from the domain of intellect with something from the domain of the emotion in the form of Chesed, and they're blending together. And so that blend together is neither one nor the other. It's a mixture or a blend of both. And so instead of having a very narrow system, we get, by having 3-4 levels, a fantastic wide system of the examples, the different pieces of human behavior and feeling that fit each one of these subsets. So this is, again, on the problem of relation, but you do gain in comprehensiveness. Okay, now why is science so important? Because science, unlike philosophy, is open. There's no closure. There's relative closure. But every time, as you know, you read a book on science and the author will say, well, you know, we solved this. But when we solved this, something opened up and we see we didn't do much good. Where are we today? We're in the life, trying to understand the life system. We're trying from practical things from the Orient. We're trying to get clues from psychoanalysis. We're trying to get clues from the artistic world as to how to enter and get some scientific understanding of the life system, of the human being, of the human life system. Even Prigogine, I mentioned once before, Prigogine, who was a biologist, won the Nobel Prize for biology, or chemistry, I forget now which one, but he said in one of his books that we don't understand the animal world until we understand the human world. And when you think about it, it's all anthropomorphized. We talk about the dog, right? We talk about the man's best friend is the dog, and so on, and so on, and so on. But a lot of this is anthropomorphic. We exactly what is the difference? We're not clear. And while I'm on that, I should point out that in the Chumash world, in the world of Torah, the differentiation between the human being and the rest of the living things is medaber. Unclus points it out in the Chumash text, it's medaber. But that doesn't give the picture, and it doesn't relate sufficiently to tonight's topic about the relation between you, yourself, and how you look at yourself so that you can have this relation with melech. Medaber means making a chalos on yourself and on other things. Making by words, by utterance of language. Austin's word was performative utterance. It wasn't a statement, it wasn't an assertion, it was a statement that, or an utterance that you heard and taped on a tape, but it functioned to establish relationship, a relation between one thing and another. Or, the day before the guy got married, he had one legal status, The next day he goes into the chuppah, he says the proper words and the proper conditions with the proper authority and so on, so on, so on. He's married. Well, what was the change? It's 24 hours. His body is the same. He's the same person emotionally. He didn't change his personality and so on. But he's a new being. He has a status called married, and then from that status there are consequences. He could have gone out with a girl before. He can't now go out with a girl just and so on because he's married, and that's part of the rules of marriage, or ex-wife, blah, 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 whatever it happens to be. So the point is that when it says medaber, it's talking about making a performative utterance. No animal can make a performative utterance. Higher animals can communicate via sounds, which loosely, or put it broadly, when we look at language in the broad, there is animal language. So an animal could communicate linguistically, not with a grammar and so on, but there's animal communication. But no animal can make a statement that functions as an utterance to establish a situation. Now, don't mix up. An animal behaves in such a way that we say he's defining his space. And don't come too close because you're going to get bitten. You start to invade his space. So animals have space, animals have had all this, but it's not coming about via performative utterance. It's, call it built in. It's built in the rest of the being of the animal to seek out mate, to mate at a certain time and so on. It's, call it instinct, call it whatever you want, but whatever it is, and it is complicated and complex, but it is not establishing a relation by a form of words which you call an utterance. This is just an aside about the importance of what it means medaber, and indeed it comes back to feed and give strength, give a chizuk to what I started with in terms of the person putting on himself a status. There's statuses that come in every legal system, and there's statuses that come in ordinary society. When the person takes a name, when the person has a certain characteristic, he says, oh, he's a bully. He's a bully can be looked at as an assertion, true or false, as a psychological fact, or it can be looked at as a declaration. I am a bully. And so to declare is to say, I declare I'm a bully. Now in the Torah system, as I pointed out before on a number of occasions, the paradigm conception of language is not assertion, therefore is not true or false. The primary use of language, especially in antiquity, not only in Israel but in other cultures, the primary use of language was the performative utterance. In the Chumash, we have it right off the bat in the creation story, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates something we don't do, but the HaKadosh Baruch Hu creates existence from a performative. Yehi, or the word Yehi, is one of the words that's used in the formula of the utterance to establish the relation. So right off the bat in the Bereshit story, which we don't talk about tonight, but you see the idea of the performative as fundamental. A thing is how we take it to be. And we put that in this performative terms, and indeed, Eza Kenegdo, the Gan Eden story was concerned with finding one piece of it had to do with finding Eza Kenegdo for Adam Arishon, and so he brought the animals and so forth, and whatever Adam Arishon saw was the thing, was the animal. Now that in different language is putting a chalos, a performative status on the thing. Then there's history of performatives. So when we say he's a man, we say this is a woman, it doesn't have to be an assertion. It's something that's come down through the centuries And so it originally was a performative and remains a performative. But one doesn't have to say every minute and declare, I am a man. So the ordinary, what was called the ordinary world of experience, and John Dewey was a pragmatist, and others, they talked about experience and nature. Nature was something not made by the human being, and then we were there to study it and to understand it. And then there was experience, which is all human. And the ordinary world, like I stressed many times, the sun moves and comes through this window every single day in the ordinary world. Because when I want to pick an apartment, I say I'd like to have a light. And so I pick it. It has nothing to do with what the sun is, nothing whatsoever. How the ordinary world, what has to be done to it in order for it to become amenable to science, to knowledge, is a very, very big story, but one of the components is that it has to be constructed. We don't deal with the sun as we see it in perception. That is not a scientific object. We have to do some things to polish it up. And when we treat it like a circle, then we can now take the properties of a circle, geometric, and now do something with interconnecting the properties and so forth. It's a big, big, big complicated picture, but the point is, right now, the point is that what was called experience is usually usually articulated, clarified in terms of psychological experience. That experience is a psychological term. And indeed, for Dewey and James and Peirce, they all wrote psychologies. Dewey wrote a book on psychology, James was a big man in psychology, and so was Peirce, and so on. And the whole pragmatic tradition has emphasized the psychological. When we came to personality psychology and psychoanalysis, then the concept of language widened up, and we started to deal with more analogy, more symbolization, and indeed more declaration, more declarative statements. When a psychiatrist is listening to a patient, oh, he's on the lookout for those stream of consciousness, and he can't catch it if the guy doesn't say anything. If there's no body language, he can't catch it. So he's on the lookout, tuned in to catch as much as possible of the experience of the person, the inner experience, and to see in conversation and to mark in his head, note down, where the person shifts from conversation, giving advice, talking about a topic, and then in conversation you have all forms of language that enter and interconnect and go instantaneously one to the other. In a 10-minute, 15-minute conversation, you'll have performative use of language. You say, hey, wait, who are you talking to? I'm Jewish. Well, that's declaration. He interrupted the talk, and he declared, because something triggered him off in the context. So he reiterated. So we've been taking all of that as psychological, experiential. But there's a dimension of the experiential which has come into vogue in the 20th century with the emphasis on this performative utterance. And especially in the context that I'm talking about tonight and in other significant contexts, the way a person looks at himself is the way he'll be able to relate to others. Reb Nachman's point can be translated, transformed into Chalos performative language and performative concept to milk the concept and get the richness that's involved in it. Okay, so science doesn't have closure. It's always open. It's relative closure. So when we had Einstein come along, he put the Newtonian physics in a different state than it was before. Before physics was Newtonian physics. Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. That was the name of his book. Fundamentals of Natural Philosophy is the word for science in the 17th century. But mathematical principles, he was the one who introduced the whole notion of differential equations and the mathematization that's required for a scientific picture. Okay, but this was the 17th century, and things shifted. And so now science has a closure on Newtonian physics, which says, yes, Newtonian physics is still live and operative on every single building and bridge and tunnel and so on, and electromagnetism, which is part of Newtonian physics. And so all of that is still viable. However, when we say physics, we have to determine what are we talking about. We're talking about Newtonian physics, we're talking about Einsteinian physics. So there's relative closure. And indeed, what happened after Einstein physics? He relatively closed Newtonian physics, so that's not the topic. That's not the topic. In a good course in science and physics, because there's some connection between, and there's differential equations and so forth, they still teach mechanics, optics. They still teach Newtonian physics. But strictly speaking, physics begins when you graduate out of Newtonian physics, Newtonian mechanics, and you get into the Einstein world and the quantum world added to it, and so you now into a different frame with a different set of concepts that have... But what happened? So there was a relativity theory that dealt with the macro world, and there was a quantum theory that dealt with the minute infinitesimal world of the particle. When I went to school, an atom was something that was not divisible further. Came from the Greeks. And that's what it was. That's an atom. Well, today we have atom. Atom! Woo-hoo-hoo! That's a big thing. A DNA molecule made up of atom. Oh, fantastic! Like in size and function, it's like a whole universe compared to some small things. When I said and postulated in speculation, maybe there are quantum effects in the body. Whoa! To have a quantum effect in the body is on the micro level. How are we even going to measure it? How are we going to capture it? So I called it a speculation, and indeed it is a speculation. Okay, but what happened? So then there was the quantum world, and what happened? There's a problem left over. How do we unite the two worlds? Still viable in physics. In theoretical physics, there's still people working on the problem of unified field. How do we put together the laws of the micro particle world with the laws of the macro world of gravitation? How do we put these two together to get a unified picture? And moreover, how does it relate to understanding life from a scientific point of view? Where are we? I call it sensitization literature. Different people are working towards setting up an ideational field, overstated, understated, with vague terms, like I use the word life energy. It's used by others, but I tell the reader I'm not defining. I don't have any definition. The people who use it, they assume that you got a glimmer of but what exactly it is, it's left open. We don't have a picture. Okay, so a unified field, still open, and whether or not life can be understood scientifically within the great revolution in 20th century physics. I say it can't, as a speculation, and I said one of the speculations was that the material, the ideas for a unified field will be logically implied by the Einstein of biology in the new life system. I called it by name Liphonic physics, just to give it a label, but it's all in the realm of speculation of where we're going. So what do we see from our point? From our point, there's relative closure. Of course there's relative closure. In common sense and in science and in things intellectual. But there's also a openness. I, for one, for example, I took the time, I spent a year on redoing and restudying the ether. There was, in Michelson-Morley experiment, was a refutation of the ether, meaning a kind of a medium that carried electric force and so forth. There was a medium, it had properties, and it was called the ether. And in the late 19th century, it was very fundamental. The textbooks dealt with it. You had to know what this was all about. I had a crazy idea. I'm not a physicist. I was teaching philosophy of science, but it dawned on me, maybe something was thrown out in the ether material that was thrown out, bypassed, not needed in the Michelson-Morley experiment, which threw the whole thing out as fundamental to physics. I said, well, maybe there's something there. Now, I was a little naive because I didn't find anything, not because I'm stupid. I'm not a physicist. I'm not a mathematician, so I didn't have enough tools. But I took the trouble to spend a year in the library reading all of this material and for the layman. It wasn't so mathematical. You read a book, a journal in 1900, it's much more readable for the layman to read. It's not all mathematical. Today it's so high mathematics that when I taught philosophy of science, I used to give a student an assignment. Go to the library, take any book in biology, take any book in physics, come in tomorrow and talk about it. Dr. Levinson, in the biology book, I understood a little bit. I'm not a biologist, but it's all English, it's all Hebrew. And there's discourse, there's words. Sure, there's some diagrams, a little mathematics, but it's not differential equations, and it's not this complicated geometry and so on, space-time. When I took a physics book, I didn't understand a word. So the student, by a demonstration in philosophy of science class, got the picture without me doing much talking. There's a big difference between a physics book and a biology book, and the character of the mathematics, the character of the model. There's much more model building in the biological than there is in the physics. And so there's models, and there's measurement, and tools for measurement, and so forth. So there's complication on side, but in our point for tonight, there's relative closure. But one thing closes, and bingo, something opens up, which is occupying the entire world today, is searching for how do we get a breakthrough on the nature of life, of human life. Darwinian biology was a very small part and made a breakthrough, sure, in terms of dealing with the human being on a, quote, empirical basis. But this is not rich enough. Darwinian biology is not rich enough to formulate from it a theory of life like we say in physics, a theoretical physics, a theory of relativity, or a theory of the quantum. And we're all looking for clues, how to do that, how to enter. And to me, one of the big relevances of Judaism and Torah for the contemporary picture is that it has a contribution to make, first from the theoretical point of view, from the big picture point of view, to show that it's automatically relevant because it deals with the central problem. And there may be some worth in going back and studying it, like in pharmaceutical companies. Every pharmaceutical company has an anthropologist who studies the culture in the past and says, oh, this culture, they said, cured some. They try to give a chemical analysis of this. If they're successful and they capture what was going on with the mixture and everything, and they make a breakthrough, we have a new pill. The world of pills, that's where we are. But we have a new pill and a new advance in medicine. And okay, so it's the same thing here, of having on the staff this picture. And again, I emphasized under this thing of the ether was saying, well, somebody may get the crazy idea that we have to go back and see what was accomplished and what was bypassed. Maybe something in the bypassing will be the clue for opening up a new biology. In other words, we're open, when we have little, as we do, we search for different things, and indeed, we go to Chinese medicine and the Orient and so on, because the application, the primary technology of the new biology is medicine, is the human being, is medicine, is advance in medicine, medical knowledge, such that we can increase the quality and quantity of life. Some go so far as to say we can control it. That's open. But at least that's the implication. The technology is not localized in building bridges. That played its role. Without the Industrial Revolution, we'd have a different world completely. And whether it's better or worse, it would leave open. But the point is, today, we're focusing attention on the biological world, the world of medicine, and with its full sweep of concern. The problem today, life translates primarily into eating and sexuality. The two fundamental topics of life are eating and sexuality, which relates now and extends up into the man-woman relationship, whether they could ever achieve completeness or relative completeness. Two people, a man and a woman, husband and wife, can they complete and become basar echad? Or is it the case that two people can never become one? That love, as deep as it is, and as fundamental as it is not a closure. It cannot capture the closedness, the perfection. There's always a relational closure. That love does not conquer all. It could conquer 99%, but not all. But there have been in the tradition people who have written and discussed and argued for love, especially between man and woman, as being the fundamental paradigm for any oneness or unity or completeness that the human being can get. And it's the closest we come to understanding first the traditional point in the theological picture, which is that Hashem is perfect and has the completeness. And the closest we could come is the man-woman relationship. And on the other hand, we say maybe Hashem doesn't have any perfection, because his view is, it's expressed in the Chumash. It says, Eya Asher Eya. My name, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, Hashem, is translated into Eya. First it says, Eya Asher Eya. Eya Asher Eya is not a name. It says, my name is Eya Asher Eya. Eya Asher Eya is a phrase. It's not a name. But then it's shortened to say Eya as a name. So Yud-Kei Vav-Kei becomes Eya. And what is that saying? What is that saying? I will be what I will be. But what I will be, I don't even know myself. I'm going to emerge and always will be there. But how I will be there and all the rest remains open. And so it says, Eya Asher Eya. I will be what I will be. Now, in the tradition, as you know, in the medieval tradition, especially in the Rambam, he translates this, I am that I am. Because the category, the fundamental category in the medieval world was the notion of being, of isness. And Hashem had a special property, set of properties, which went with the isness, and indeed we can't know it, we have to know the attributes and so on and so on and so on. But the point is, it's translated into I am that I am. Whereas the real translation, it says in Hebrew, the real translation is I will be what I will be. One is dynamic, one is static, one I'm suggesting is open, the other is closed. Indeed, the metaphysical picture for the medieval world was a closed picture. And so it affected everything from Hashem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu down. Everything had reflected, shall we say. Everything in the human world reflected the perfection and closure and completeness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, of God in the system. The new view, or the view that's coming through, is that when you start putting together these components that I'm talking about the chalos and the utterance and catching stream of consciousness and so forth, one is beginning to emerge with a different picture that seems to be closer to the text when it says, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh. You should know that in classical Kabbalah, which has it has sfirot, it also has partsufim, representations of female and male. It has 5 or 6 different modes of describing the world of the neshama, the world of the higher world. So it has one of them is in terms of names. So there's Elohim, there's Shaddai, and so on, there's names. And you should know that one of the secrets of the system is the stress that's put on Ehyeh Bimkom Yud-Kei Vav-Kei. You know, the name Ehyeh takes on a certain highness and priority more than the name, just like the Chumash says. Because we're explaining Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, we're explaining Hashem, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, the fundamental name of God in the picture, in the Chumash. We're explaining that in terms of something else. Ehyeh, a dynamic picture which opens and allows itself to be interpreted the way I said. In other words, I will be what I will be, but exactly what I will be, I myself don't know. That's the orientation. Then we get into how the human being has to relate as being a partner with Hashem and so on. How we interpret that is remaining open for the moment. Sometime we'll discuss it in full. But the basic idea is that it opens up a significantly different entry into all the fundamental topics, all the fundamental questions. And so it coheres with the scientific picture because science is open. Now you see the openness, unbelievable openness. Unified field still remains to be solved, and the relation between physics and the life system remains open. However we do it, that's the next view. Nobody has shown that it's impossible to get a science of life, of the human life system. In the sense we're talking. We're not talking now about the body. We're talking about the body plus the emotions. And I think all the way up from behavior, of psychological stimulus response type behaviors, up into personality, psychology, and psychoanalysis. We're dealing with the full range. Psychoanalysis means we're dealing with the unconscious. In addition to the conscious, in addition to the nature of thinking. Look at the thorny set of problems. This science is going to have to relate and say something about language, about the human being in the fullness, and includes the unconscious. One can't say, well, we're going to leave that out. After Freud, we can't leave it out. It's part of the reality of the human being and has to be treated and will be treated in the science. Nobody has shown that it's impossible. Until they show that it's impossible in principle, my ideas and others' ideas, our group's ideas, is struggling to get insights, trigger off insights in others, to set up a field, what I call an ideational field for the emergence of the Einstein of biology. In England, every 2 years, there was a guy named Waddington who was a biologist. Every 2-3 years, he ran a conference for many, many years on the possibility of a theoretical biology. Everything in biology today is, in the last analysis, observable. Electron microscope observes everything in biology. There is no such thing as what used to be called theoretical entity. Theoretical entities existed in physics. You don't observe the particle, you observe the effects or the relation of the particle into other things, to other physics parameters. You don't, the particle was used to be called a theoretical entity. When we split, nobody has split the electron, but other parts of the nucleus have been split, and we have mesons and so on and so on. We split the atom. It's no longer this simple thing, very complicated, and size and different measures and all the rest of it. Okay. Another aside, again, no closure. Plato who was the father of closure, of system in philosophy, and the father of the all-comprehensiveness of philosophy. He had a student, Aristotle, who broke with the master and had a different conception of philosophy. But with respect to closure, he had a kind of a semi-picture. He didn't have quite the Plato closure, but he didn't have no closure. However, relatively speaking, they're both in the same boat, and Greek philosophy was pre-17th century science. There was no science in the Greek philosophy. There were empirical observations. Archimedes' bathtub, Archimedes displacing the water, I mean, that's an empirical observation, but it's only an ingredient in what eventually will become a physics. That's not a physics. That's an observation which can be measured and so on, and will play a role when we get a physics, as indeed we did. And so that's treated, we can do that in public school. We give the kid a session and they perform, with a cup and so on, and we have this place in the water, and then we analyze it. So it's part of the entry, but it's certainly very far away from the worked out of the physics. Okay, B'derech Hagav, I was started about Plato. Plato refuted, there were in Greece there was the atomists, a school of thought that dealt with the atomists, and there was the sophists. Most of the dialogues, Plato wrote dialogues, most of the dialogues were relating to people who were sophists. Plato never refuted the sophists. Why? Because the sophist can always ask a why question on any conclusion that's reached, including a first principle, an architectonic principle of which there's none higher. So the sophist is the closest in ancient world to the pragmatic tradition in the contemporary world. And Plato never successfully refuted the sophists, because they had an intrinsic methodology which left everything open. Now, if you leave everything open, you destroy knowledge. So there has to be some relative closure. So your picture is not a continuous line, your picture is jumps on the line, where every time there's a jump, there's a relative closure of the domain that we're dealing with. And in life, per se, there is this relative closure. And it changes overnight, instantaneously. Bingo, 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 never took a pill. Now I got to take 3 pills. I mean, it changes overnight, bingo. And then you have to now restructure and catch that stream of consciousness in yourself to tell you and give you clues how you're handling the change, how you're handling the new, you're in part a new person. This is a new experience. Or somebody have a traumatic experience. You mentioned about the girl, when somebody has a big traumatic experience, that, well, it's so significant, it colors everything. It colors all aspects. Well, the person has to live through that, will live through that. But part of the way to do it is through the performative on oneself and catching all the material that comes with it when you make the thing. So, I use my favorite example. Favorite example is that in the Kabbalat Ari, for example, we come for Rosh Hashanah. So the Ari is organized, one of Shara Kavanot is one of the books. He has 8 books, and then he has like introductions to the big system, and he has 8 hachaim, which is the big system, worked out in the full. But in his discussion, when we learn it, we learn Shara Kavanot as the basic text, because that deals with the holidays and the prayers of the weekday, the Shabbat, the holidays, the Rosh Chodesh, and so on and so on. And so you started that way. That was a tradition in terms of teaching, so that you were relating to the calendar, to the holidays as they came up. And one of the things that was so fundamental and unbelievable, when he's dealing with the shofar, so he's analyzing the sound, the type of the sound, and so on and so on. And all of a sudden he brings in the red face of the guy who's blowing. what does a red face got to do with the shofar? Suppose the guy had a different blood consistency, he didn't get red in the face. He blew shofar. If he blew it properly, it's kosher. What's the problem? He blew, people heard it, he fulfilled the mitzvah. What does it have to do with redness in the face? Well, for the Ari, which is the Kabbalah system before, we say pre-Newton, pre-scientific revolution, which has a different switch after the scientific revolution with the Vilna Gaon and the Ramchal. These are the Einsteins of the system, let's put it that way. But in the Ari, which is 1550, this is a time before Newton, 100 years, whatever, 16th century, not 17th century. And so in the Kabbalah Ari, the vision, what you see, what you hear, including the redness of the face, is given a Kabbalah interpretation in terms of the Sefirot. Just like the sound of the shofar and the patterning and so on gives a different interpretation in terms of the Sefirot of what that is. We're giving a Sefirot interpretation of this, and redness of the face is included. In other words, if we deal with the reality, all the things that are happening in the person become relevant. So it becomes relevant, the reddening of the face. Nothing to do with the halacha. In the Kabbalah, the first time I came across the idea that second day Rosh Hashanah is the Rabbanan. It's a lesser status in terms of the fulfillment of the calendaring of the time and so on. But even though it's the Rabbanan and not the Raita, it has more power, more efficacy than the first day, and is treated in higher level sefirot as compared with the first day. What do you mean? What are you talking about? It should be, if the halacha is that's the Raisa and this is the Rabbanan, well, the Raisa should take precedent. In halacha, it takes precedent. There are questions about the Raita of first day that are not relevant to the second, and vice versa, because one is the Raita and one is the Rabbanan. They have a different halachic status. And so the questions that the Gemara asks are different type questions relative to each one. Okay. But in the Kabbalah systematic, it doesn't have a rule that says that we must follow the right of the Rabbanan. Indeed, the Rabbanan is part of the whole halacha of Rosh Hashanah, and so in the systematic working out of the halacha of Rosh Hashanah, the second day becomes more important than the first day. I asked my teacher at the time, I said, what are you doing? It doesn't make any sense. He said, well, there's no rule. The right of the Rabbanan is a distinction in the halacha, which is fundamental, but it's not a distinction in the Kabbalah. And furthermore, for those who hold that the halachic system of Judaism is the core and the fundament and the set of principles of how to live, of chai b'hem, second to everything, including the Kabbalah, whenever there's a machloket, a difference of opinion between the Kabbalah people and the halacha, the machloket goes according to the halacha. So that the Ari won't break the halacha and say, well, I'm writing up a new picture because it has more importance in the system. They have relative separability, and the halacha remains a deraita is a deraita and has a higher status than the Rabbanan. However, there are laws about how do we include the Rabbanans in the system of halacha and so on and so on. That's all part of the picture. To 2 points. One is that completeness can be viewed as a need for control. To have loose ends that every once in a while come up to perk you and wake you up and say, I'm missing something. That is very valuable, but it's very painful. The person wants and strives to be more than himself, to get some kind of completeness. And one has to realize that there's no predictability There's risk-taking. Like I said about Eya She'eya. There's no predictability what I will be, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says. So there's risk. There has to be risk. There has to be taking a chance that things will go in the direction. So there's this tension in the human being between the striving and wanting and needing completeness to have a certain at-restness. And on the other hand, realizing that it cannot be done. It's not in the human world. And indeed, theologically, on the view that I'm holding, it's not in Hashem either. One last point. One of the people who caught this whole thing was Samuel Beckett, the playwright, one of the greatest novelists and playwrights of the 20th century. And in his work, he had a play called Breath, Hevel, 57 seconds. The curtain goes up, and there's two garbage cans and beams of light that cross over, and the curtain comes down. That's a play. What did Beckett try to do? Beckett said that there's always something to be done. There's never final completion. I'm going to take the world of art, my field, he says, which is literature, the novel, and the play, the drama. I'm going to take ingredients out that everybody says if they're not in the picture, you're not dealing with the art that we're talking about. So, in Waiting for Godot, Pogo, or whatever his name was, Pogo, and he's talking to somebody at the end of the play, and he says, goodbye, goodbye, and they don't walk off stage. Well, the diction has to match the action. Well, what kind of play is that? What kind of thing is that? Diction has to match the action. Because he says, now, what, the guy's fooling around? It's a dream, it's this, it's that. It makes equivocation and all kinds of complication. It's a simple thing. So he took away the timing, the length, and so on. In the novel, he took away the punctuation. If you read Beckett's books, novels, there's no capitals, no punctuation. How can you have a sentence? How can you have a novel without punctuation? So he took every feature of the artwork, in this case the literary artwork, and he eliminated it. And he now asks the question, can we still, properly speaking, talk about 57 seconds, curtain go up, curtain come down, as a play? And his answer was, in every case, absolutely yes. And the punchline of Beckett was Godot. Waiting for Godot was his highest level play. And in that play, the punchline is, there's always something to be done. And Godot, a lot of speculation on where did he get that from. Godot is, go, do, it. Go, do, apostrophe, it. Go, do, it. He uses his technique of eliminating the usual spelling and so on, and punctuation and so on, to carry the message that there is no hakol hovel. There is no full unmeaning. There's always a dimension, an aspect of something that remains, in our terms for tonight, incomplete. In the incompleteness. And in that incompleteness is his art form. And so this gem about Beckett, I didn't see it in the literature, but that's to me what the name means. That you can, everybody said it's God. It's God in the picture. G-O-D, it's God. I don't think that's what he had in mind. He was concerned with this whole picture. I put him in the book, when I wrote the book on the Rav, I said, you know, the Gemara says, Chokhmah by a non-Jew, you should take and absorb and think about it. And so, well, I said that he had a fantastic picture of showing that there's no hevel, there's no full unmeaning. In other language, in theological language, Hashem is always in the picture. There's never hakol havel. So, we just put it in the principle. There's no hakol havel. There's no hester panim. Hashem never hides his face. This is against the traditional theology, which is saying that God has a perfection. We don't have the perfection. We're imperfect. Hashem is perfect. And so you have hester panim as a fundamental principle in the classical theology, which the Rav repeated. And here, I think, Beckett had an insight that's closer to what I'm talking about, of the having to learn how to live and what to do to live with incompleteness.